Two houses. The Smithsonian and the Valentine cases on the Mount Pisgah corpus, each stated at full strength. Barrows Research, version 1.0, August 2026. The rule of this film. Neither institution is on trial here. Each case is stated as its own defenders would state it, at maximum strength, before any adjudication. One discipline is imposed throughout. Each item carries its actual evidentiary grade, because several elements, on both sides, circulate in the literature at a higher grade than their sources will support. Primary documents are marked as primary. Hearsay relayed inside a primary document is marked as hearsay. Retrospective journalism is marked as retrospective. A press paraphrase is not treated as testimony. And no verdict is offered at the end. That is the point of the exercise. Part 1. The Smithsonian Case. Rao, 1882. The first statement. Charles Rao, curator at the Smithsonian, judges the carvings abnormal for the region and likely post-Columbian, the work of a few individuals, possibly Indian. This is the earliest institutional skepticism on record, and it is contemporaneous asserting curator on the objects in the period. The charge in its strongest form is a no-parallel charge. These objects have no regional analog, and their sudden appearance in quantity in a single collector's hands demands an explanation. Rao also identifies the iconographic anomalies, the exotic fauna, including the object that came to be called the Burnet's Hill camel. Note one thing about this statement, because it will matter later. In his first and most careful published account, the Smithsonian's own curator alleges no fraud, no commerce, and no forgers, and names Indian makers as his first possibility. The grade is primary. Rao, December 10, 1885. The chart. 3 years later, Rao gives a newspaper interview, and the position has changed. Asked by the reporter what made him suspect in the first place that they were frauds, he answers, "These objects lack evidence of age. They are mostly unhurt and show no traces of weathering, but the chief thing is that the manufacturers have in many cases departed from aboriginal forms and brought in new features which led to the discovery of the fraud. I have a long practice in such matters and am not easily deceived." That is the uniqueness argument in its own words. The objects betray themselves precisely by being unlike anything else, and the curator's authority for reading that departure is his own long practice. The 1885 elaboration, mechanism and anachronism. First, the mechanism, and Rao states it flatly. In order to give them an antique appearance, the makers put them in ferruginous water. When the reporter is shown the objects, the account records that in the interstices could be seen little rusty spots made, as it is alleged, by the washing or boiling in ferruginous water to give the appearance of age. That is not a vague suspicion. It is a named aging process, attributed to named makers, on inspected objects. Second, the anachronisms. When the maker came to elaborate, Rao says, he brought out things which an Indian would never think of expressing, and committed anachronisms, such as producing a figure with a gun in his hands, or an animal belonging to another fauna. He names a camel or dromedary. He names a man with a gun, and reasons that the gun was introduced by whites, so such a sculpture could not predate their arrival. And third, a manufacturing tell, shading. Little lines worked on the sides of the figures, which he calls a process never seen before on any Indian sculpture. This is a primary published interview. On the compiler's standing ruling, it is an allegation, not a finding. The duplicate set, a controlled procurement. This is the strongest single item in the skeptical record, and it deserves to be stated without hedging. Professor Baird instructed a resident of Haywood County to obtain a similar collection for the museum, and he did it covertly. In Rao's own words, it was not known that they were wanted for the museum. The commissioned gentlemen came across the same men. Specimens were ordered. And Rao's claim is specific. They were made by the same parties, of the same material, and exhibited the same workmanship as that which characterized those exhibited by Mr. Valentine. Rao then takes the reporter into the large hall of antiquities and produces half a dozen or more little stone images, animals and men, carved out of soft stone. They looked, the account says, as though they had been taken from the shelves of a toy shop. That is a controlled procurement experiment, run by the National Museum in the 1880s, and if it holds it is very close to decisive. One open task attaches to it, and it is the most consequential open task in this entire dispute. The United States National Museum duplicate set is a traceable accession. It has not yet been traced. Those objects, if they survive, are the physical control group for the whole corpus. Emmert, 1883. The allegations. W. Emmert, in the field for the Bureau of Ethnology, transmits 3 allegations in his letters of April 25 and May 24, 1883. That the images had been manufactured for 4 years. That supply to Valentine was exclusive, and that objects were buried in order to be found. Those 3 are the core of the fraud case as it has been received ever since. And Emmert supplies something stronger than allegation alongside them. His own procurement demonstrates that in 1883 there existed, locally, carvers able and willing to produce images of this kind for pay. That capability is not inferred from anything. It is documented in his own purchasing records. The grade divides. The 3 allegations are primary documents carrying anonymous hearsay, the letters are real, the informants are not named. The carver capability is primary and demonstrated, and it is the strongest single item the skeptical case has. The demand-led sequence, and the ledger's own admissions. The skeptical case includes a fine sequence led by the collector's own requests. Valentine sketching and describing the objects he wanted. Valentine asking, in writing, whether the hunters ever see any little stone images shaped like men, animals and birds, with the first such images appearing months later. And the retrospective passage in which Valentine is said to have written that it may reasonably be argued, perhaps, that he was largely responsible for having suggested the appearance of many objects. Separately, the family's own ledger records many objects candidly as no ticket, that is, without proof means. And the same ledger carries an imitations entry, which proves that fabricated pieces circulated into the collecting stream. Now the grades, and they diverge sharply. The 2 quotations and the sketches claim are attested only in 1950 journalism. They are absent from the accessible Osborne correspondence transcriptions, and they are carried as unverified retrospective attribution pending a search of the Valentine Museum manuscript side. The ledger entries, by contrast, are primary, and they are the collector's own admissions against interest. The institutional verdict, and the modern test. In 1883, Cyrus Thomas classifies the objects as ethnologic specimens. In 1894, the same director, in the same bureau, reclassifies them as bogus articles. That reclassification is the moment the institutional verdict enters the permanent literature, and it has governed the reception of this corpus ever since. The August 23, 1883 dispatch account of the Valentine Sons expedition reports that Kuala elders knew nothing of the images. And in 2025, among the first 8 objects from this corpus ever tested, 2 thermoluminescence results placed the last firing event within roughly the last century. The skeptical case closes on a burden rather than a conclusion, and this is its strongest form. The burden rests on each object, and nothing yet tested has carried it. 2 grade notes. The 1894 reclassification is primary. The dispatch account is a friendly press paraphrase of an interview, not a letter and not testimony, and it stands. Part 2. The Valentine case. The site and the chain. The Valentine case begins from something not in dispute. The site is unquestionably an authentic native mortuary and ceremonial landscape, and the Valentine pits were demonstrably cut into it. That is proven at the site level, independent of any individual object. Whatever else is true, this was not an invented location. The collecting chain is long, dated, paid, and geographically coherent, and it includes proof means control requests that predate any controversy. That is, the collector was asking for fine spot information before anyone had accused him of anything. The exhibition corpus is proof means indexed at the fine spot level across a 156-row ledger, with its gaps and its known imitations candidly segregated rather than concealed. And his subagent's 1883 invoice prices a fabricated piece openly, in writing, as one, quote, imitation book. A conspiracy does not itemize its fakes on the invoice. The site finding is proven. The ledger and the invoice are primary. Valentine's documented conduct. 4 things are on the record about how man Valentine behaved. He refused newspaper publicity. He advanced no maker theory, he never told anyone who had made these objects or why. He invited scientists to scrutinize the corpus, and the period press of 1885 records it. And in July of 1880 he personally unearthed objects at the Burnett and Miller sites. The argument the Valentine side makes from this is a profile argument, and it is a strong one. This is the opposite of a hoaxer's conduct. A fabricator seeks publicity, because publicity is the point. A fabricator supplies an authenticating story, because the story is what sells the object. A fabricator resists examination, and a fabricator does not put his own hands in the ground at a site he could more safely stay away from. And the passage attributed to him in 1950, that he was largely responsible for having suggested the appearance of many objects, if ever verified, reads on this profile as candor and not as confession. A man concealing a fraud does not write down that he may have suggested the objects into existence. The conduct is contemporaneous and primary. The accuser and the money. The principal accuser was a rival collector and a financially precarious temporary field hand, and by his own employer's later record, a compromised witness. That is not a characterization supplied by the defense. It is in the Bureau's own employment file. His letters document his procurement of fabricated pieces. They do not document anyone else's. And the central manufacture and burial claim rests on informants whose anonymity left it unexaminable then and leaves it unfalsifiable now. Then the money, which is the sharpest point in the Valentine case. The informant supplied a figure of over $2,000 paid out for relics in 3 years. The verified remittance stream visible in the record is roughly $215 to $220, an order of magnitude below, at rates and for purposes that fit travel, freight, and small piece rate collecting rather than the sustained payment of skilled fabricators over 4 years. The employer's record is primary. The allegations remain anonymous hearsay. What the same interview also contains. 4 things sit inside or beside that 1885 charge, and the Valentine case rests heavily on them. First, Rao exonerates Valentine's intent in the same conversation. Valentine, he says, exhibited in good faith. The objects are charged, the collector is not. Rao never accused man Valentine of perpetrating a fraud. Second, the paragraph that circulated most widely, that Professor Baird had had a duplicate set made, ending, "Grade is humbug," is attributed to Rao, a charge he did not make, and the period press verifies that correction directly in the Richmond Dispatch of December 15, 1885. Third, Rao made no rejoinder to the published replies in the New York World and in London Nature. The strongest counter-arguments of the period went unanswered by him. Fourth, on the exotic fauna, the point most often used to prove Old World fakery, Rao's own 1882 analysis had offered the alternative. The models he suggested were New World animals, the peccary, the tapir, and the llama. The Smithsonian's own curator proposed that the anachronistic readings are misidentifications of American animals, and he closes the interview on the Davenport elephant pipes. "Mind," he tells the reporter, "I do not say that the Davenport elephant pipes are not genuine. I think it is probable that they are. But we must wait for further corroborative discoveries. Those pipes were later judged fraudulent." That is a fair caution on the method of the man doing the classifying. The modern answer to the ferruginous claim. Rao read the rusty spots in the interstices as artificial aging, objects washed or boiled in ferruginous water to counterfeit age. That is a mechanism claim, and it can be answered on the record, because a competing explanation was already in writing 5 years before he said it. On the 10th of August, 1880, Benjamin Valentine wrote to Osborne asking whether hearth-like deposits occurred at the bottoms of the graves, and which of the objects had been found burned. In the working transcription he writes, "Many of them have been burned. Sometimes there was a general burning. The objects were put together and fire applied, and everything that would burn was consumed." The grade on that is exact. It is a contemporaneous research question put to a field agent, not Valentine's eyewitness report of a fire. But its importance is chronological. Deliberate collective burning of the image-bearing group was a live explanation in 1880, 3 years before Emmert was deployed and 5 years before the Washington Star interview. Then the corroboration. In 1915, George Hay recorded masses of charcoal and a deposit of charred acorns and nuts at the Richard Platt Mound, the mound later designated 31HW1. In a neighboring mound he excavated 17 fire pits. Pit 12 held ashes, burned deer bones, mica, a potsherd, and charcoal. And the modern catalog audit places 2,706 heat proxy records and 34,614 parse units at that same mound. Ferruginous water stains a surface. None of this proves that any tested object was heated. What it establishes is that a genuine thermal environment existed at the mound, documented independently 3 times, and that Rao's aging mechanism is no longer the only available explanation for a discolored surface. The Old Woman and the Fire in the Graves. An old woman working Gwyn's land, Gwynnis, in the London Album Ledger numbers 49b and 56 is the reported source for nearly all the images recovered from marked graves. And the description attached to that source is specific: a hearth-like layer, a rock cover, and more images below. Then Valentine writes to Osborne seeking confirmation. Did we understand you to say that the old woman, who got the objects at Grimes, stated that there was evidence of fire in the grave she opened? And was the fire on the top or inside of the grave? In a separate letter he presses further, we would be glad if he would go and see for himself about the hearth spoken of by the old woman, and then he can give us a full description of how they appeared, as he opened them. This is the object-to-fire context association that every other line of the thermal argument lacks. Not fire somewhere at the site, but an excavator recovering image-bearing objects from graves she reported as containing fire, under a rock cover with a hearth-like layer. 3 limits hold it at its grade, and they are the compiler's own. It is graded open, a primary lead requiring land record and concordance research. Valentine is querying a relayed report rather than recording his own observation. And the localities named are Grimes, Gwyn's land, and near the graves at Mr. Osborne's, not Garden Creek Mound No. 1, so this does not merge with the Mound 1 heat audit. Why the ferruginous mechanism fails. 4 independent lines run against Rao's stated aging method, 3 documentary, 1 instrumental. First, chronology. Deliberate collective burning of the image-bearing group was already in the correspondence on the 10th of August, 1880, 3 years before Emmerich was deployed and 5 before the Washington Star interview. The competing explanation predates the charge. Second, scope. Rao's rusty spots in the interstices follow directly in the same passage from his description of the shading, the little lines worked on the sides of the figures. The interstices are the carved grooves. He was describing iron lodged in incised line work on the surface, not absorption into the stone. The claim reaches surface topography and no further. Third, substrate. Steatite is non-porous. There is no infiltration route into the body regardless of what sits in the grooves. And iron lodging in carved line work is equally what long burial in ferruginous Appalachian soil produces, so the observation is non-diagnostic between deliberate soaking and genuine deposition, and Rao offered no way to tell them apart. Fourth, chemistry. Conversion of yellow goethite to red hematite requires heat in the region of 250 to 400 degrees Celsius. A cold soak cannot produce it. And because goethite cannot survive above about 400 degrees, any zone still holding unconverted goethite would set a ceiling as well as a floor, a bracket readable by Raman across the existing fracture with no new sampling. One further point on Rao's authority. His technique claim was that shading is a process never seen before on any Indian sculpture. If that line work is hatch or crosshatch, the claim fails on the published comparative record. Crosshatch is among the oldest abstract marks known, recurs on every inhabited continent, and is at home on Mississippian gorgets. Universality cannot establish a connection between 2 sites. For exactly that reason it defeats a claim that a mark is unique to one hand. All of which retires the mechanism. None of which authenticates an object. A heating event carries no date and no maker, and Rao himself alleged that the makers treated objects deliberately. The burden shifts. It is not discharged. Heat media, and the test that discriminates. The thresholds first, and these are question framing values rather than determinations about any Garden Creek specimen. Complete or near-complete thermoluminescence resetting requires roughly 400 to 500 degrees Celsius sustained. Half-done statite conversion in steatite, roughly 800 to 900. Incipient vitrification of daub or fired clay, 800 to 1100. Fuel ash slag, 1000 to 1200. Coal clinker, 1000 to 1300. True silicate slag, 1100 to 1400. Note the first line, because it governed everything else. The reset threshold sits far below the slag range. A fire that never approached slag temperatures could still have emptied a luminescence signal. Then the specimen. Catalog 2115M3123. 1 clinker. Category slag, material slag. Site HW1, 31 HW1, accession 2115, recovered in the controlled 1967 Co. and Reed season, RLA record 68233. If it is fuel ash slag or vitrified DOP, it evidences a deposit capable in principle of exceeding a reset threshold. If it is coal clinker, it indicates historical or modern combustion and possible later contamination. Those readings run in opposite historical directions, and nothing but X-ray diffraction, scanning electron microscopy, petrographic thin section, Raman or FTIR will separate them. The depth profile, 4 histories, 4 predictions. This is what makes the whole dispute empirically separable, including Rao's side of it. A mapped depth profile on the 2 datable objects predicts 4 different behaviors for 4 different histories. If the objects are of modern manufacture, the accumulated dose is uniformly low at every depth sampled from original fabric, and there is no through-body thermal alteration attributable to any later event. If an older object was completely reset by a later fire, the dose is also uniformly low, but the age corresponds to that later heating episode, and through-body and stathite, sintering, vitrification, or thermal microcracking may be present alongside it. If the reset was only partial, the signature is unmistakable. The measured age increases with depth. Younger near the exterior, older toward the original core, with surface proximate alteration over a less altered interior. And if the sampled material was never original at all, the result simply follows the age of the repair, the fill, the coating, or the adhering matrix. The candidate object is the fractured bare form, whose exposed interior is lighter, more granular, and more strongly colored than its darker exterior. That appearance is a reason to test. It is not itself proof of fire cracking or mineral conversion. Ordinary weathering, patina, and iron staining remain alternatives, which is precisely Rao's point restated as a hypothesis rather than a verdict. If the profile comes back flat, the sample locations are indisputably original fabric, and no later thermal alteration is present, then the reheating interpretation is substantially weakened, and that is a significant adverse result. Both institutions should want the answer. The hardening of the adverse case, 1882 to 1894. The thesis states the method in a sentence. The second finding is not the priority date, it is what the priority date exposes. Set the same institution's statements side by side across 12 years. 13th of July, 1882, in Nature. The carvings are abnormal, not typical, post-Columbian, made by a few individuals, and in Rao's own words, of the Indian, or, perhaps, even of the Caucasian, race. The argument rests on the old world animal. Is fraud alleged? No. There are no forgers, no commerce, no prices, and no aging method. Who are the makers? Indians first. Caucasians second, as a possibility. 10th of December, 1885, in the Washington Star. Now there are the forgers. The business pays well. There are enormous prices. There is ferruginous water aging. There is the shelf of a toy shop. There is the shading line work. Is fraud alleged? Yes, throughout. Who are the makers? Heywood Men. A commercial forgery ring. 1894, Cyrus Thomas. Bovis Articles. A settled verdict. Every element of the commercial forgery narrative, the ring, the prices, the ferruginous water, the toy shop, appears nowhere in 1882. The first and most careful published statement by the Smithsonian's own curator alleged no fraud, no commerce, and D28. What the sequence shows and what it does not. The narrative accretes after Emmert is deployed in 1883. Between Rao's first published statement and the interview that carried the forgery ring stands the field season that produced the allegations. And those allegations arrived pre-sealed. Emmert, in the letters of the 24th to 30th of May, 1883, transmits the manufacture for 4 years claim, and states that the informant's names should never be used. The charge was transmitted with its own sources withheld, which is why it was unexaminable then and remains unfalsifiable now. A standing ruling attaches to the whole of Rao's newspaper record. He is classified a hostile critic, an adverse party to the dispute, not a neutral referee, and all of his newspaper statements are to be read as allegations rather than findings. And the ruling cuts both ways. It does not convert his hostility into proof of anything about the objects. The grade is open. This is a narrative change finding of the same class as D18 and D19, Thomas's own move from ethnologic specimens to bogus articles, except that this one runs inside a single witness. And the framing the thesis insists on is environmental, not conspiratorial. No court or interior order to the Smithsonian concerning these objects has been located, and none is claimed. What is documented is that an accusation gained content it did not originally have in a specific direction, after a specific deployment, and then hardened into the permanent literature. That is a fact about the record. It is not, by itself, a fact about anyone's intentions. The depositional and policy grounds. The radiocarbon series shows Garden Creek occupied from Middle Woodland Canestee through Mississippian Pisgah into a historic Qualla contact horizon, with a cast bronze bell in a dated Mound 1 context. That is a long and genuine ceremonial sequence into which image-bearing deposits could plausibly fall. The now verified Bushyhead letter of December 15, 1880 supplies a primary Euro-Western North Carolina Cherokee rainmaking attribution that predates the conflict entirely, hedged, it should be said, by the writer himself. The 1883 Code of Indian Offenses gave federal institutions a motive context for delegitimating precisely this category of medicine practice object. And on the modern testing, the program returned no result at all on 6 of the 8 samples, and it tested Zone 2's relationship to repairs and consolidants had not yet been mapped. On this view, blanket dismissal repeats a 19th-century institutional verdict that was never evidentially earned. Part 3. Where both houses stand now. 2026. The record as presently held. On July 6, 2026, Christina Kieser-Vita of the Valentine responded that she had sent everything the Valentine received from Oxford Authentication, and that she had no further technical data for review. That response did not produce the back-end data, the signal data, the method notes, the methodological backup, and it did not provide the requested authorization for Oxford Authentication to communicate directly with the researcher about the retained technical record. The consequence is exact, and it constrains both institutions equally. The thermoluminescence conclusions remain summary level, and they are not independently auditable from the produced record. This bears most heavily on the 2 results placing a firing event within the last century. Because if the tested objects are tied to the 1879 to 1883 collection history, such a result postdates the claimed discovery period and is anomalous. It could reflect modern manufacture. It could equally reflect later reheating, repair material, or contaminant sampling. The produced record cannot distinguish between those possibilities. Neither institution's case is advanced or retired by data nobody can audit. No verdict. The Smithsonian case is strongest exactly where it is documentary. A serving curator's contemporaneous judgment. A demonstrated local carving capability, proved by the accuser's own purchasing. A collector's ledger that admits imitations entered the stream, and a reclassification the Bureau made in its own words, from ethnologic specimens to bogus articles. The Valentine case is strongest at exactly the same kind of place. A site proven authentic and demonstrably cut into. A provenience index ledger that segregates its own fakes rather than hiding them. An invoice that names one in writing. An accuser whom his own employer's record describes as compromised. And a money trail in order of magnitude short of what the allegation requires. And both cases weaken at the same place, wherever they rest on anonymous informants, on retrospective journalism, or on a press paraphrase of an interview. No blanket verdict is available in either direction. Not all real. Not all fraudulent. What remains is resolution object, by catalog number, by custody branch, by condition map, and by material test. That is not a failure to conclude. It is the only conclusion the record will bear. 2 houses. The Smithsonian and the Valentine cases, stated at full strength. Both cases are presented as written in Reassessing the Garden Creek/Mount Pisgah Provenance Problem, Consolidated Master Thesis, sections 6.1 and 6.2. Sources include Route 1882, Thomas 1883 and 1894, the Emerald Letters of April and May 1883, the Richmond Dispatch of December 15, 1885, the London Album Ledger, the Bushyhead Letter of December 15, 1880, and the Oxford Authentication Program of 2025. Vincent Barrows, Barrows Research, August 2026. Archival quotations and accession numbers remain pending original documents verification before external citation.